Eccoci qui, buongiorno, siamo alla seconda giornata degli IVI Pro Days 2020, che è appunto l'evento è iniziato ieri sera con una prima lecture dedicata alla cultura messicana. Oggi siamo qui con Konstantinos Dimopoulos, game urbanist e designer. Tra l'altro ha lavorato a giochi come The Sinking City, Ex Novo, A Place for the Unwilling e Lake. Konstantinos ci parlerà di città virtuali e di come creare scenari virtuali credibili e anche immersivi, e anche poi di come tradurre in gioco luoghi reali alla luce appunto delle esigenze di narrative e di gameplay, per cui diciamo che ci interessa molto parlarne perché di fatto IVIPRO si occupa anche di questo, di tradurre in gioco luoghi reali, nel caso specifico luoghi italiani, quindi Konstantinos ci darà un po' il suo punto di vista. Ora ecco, introduco un po' brevemente in inglese, do il benvenuto in inglese a Konstantinos. Welcome, Konstantinos. So
Lovely being here.
I switched from Italian to English because maybe it's better for you. Maybe you can understand English better than Italian. Thank you for accepting our invitation. And I think that today's lecture will be very helpful in understanding the process of translation from the real world to virtual worlds. Konstantinos, you are going to focus on how to create immersive virtual city environments. I think it will be very helpful for our public. And I think that you are also going to show us some example of successful game cities. So I give the floor to you, to your lecture. And another thing in Italian, ricordo a tutti, a tutte che potete fare domande durante la lecture, e poi ci sarà alla fine una sessione di Q&A, quindi gli ultimi 15 minuti. Vi ricordo anche, però comparirà più volte durante la diretta, che potete, alla fine della lecture potremo incontrare Konstantinos all'interno di questa stanza virtuale, di questa virtual room, per scambiare ulteriori chiacchiere anche in maniera più informale. Quindi questo link è quello per accedere alla stanza, ma in realtà vi comparirà anche durante la lecture nei commenti, è anche disponibile nell'ultimo post pubblicato da IVIPRO, quindi se volete poi alla fine della lecture parlare con Konstantinos potete farlo. Adesso quindi tolgo questi banner, condivido, I'm going to share your presentation on the screen, and I'm going to remove myself from the screen so you can start your lecture, but I'm here, so if you need anything, I'm here, even if I'm in background, but I'm going to be here. Thank you again.
Okay, thank you very much, Andrea, for the introduction, and it's actually lovely being here. Admittedly, it would have been even lovelier, meeting you all in Italy. But I think this is something we will eventually manage to do in the future. So today's talk, as Andrea said, is indeed on the art of building virtual cities. And I am Konstantinos Dimopoulos. And thankfully, I don't have to introduce myself too much because Andrea covered that wonderfully. I am a game urbanist. So I am working on the city side of games, and also, exploring and studying their geographies. I have worked on several commercial and both, mainstream and more indie stuff. I have worked on, MMO Sid and The Sinking City and the forthcoming Lake game from Game Use. And I'm also, writing about game cities and virtual cities in a book that will be published in a month or so. It's called Virtual Cities, and it is an atlas of game cities. And I've also been dabbling in, tabletop games and their civic expressions. Recently released with Martin a game called Ex Novo, which uses dice and tables to guide you towards the creation of a city. Also, ages ago I earned a PhD in urban planning and geography. So this whole game urbanism thing has been, an attempt to combine gaming with real life geography and planning. And with that, let's start focusing on the actual matter at hand, which is game cities. The first pretty obvious question is, what are game cities? Well, quite sensibly, game cities are all the cities and all the urban environments that are found in games. This is a very general description, of course, but as we look further into it, we see that game cities also strive to be believable illusions. They are also spaces, actual spaces found in games that have to also be approached via level design, that is, via the discipline that handles how things are spaced and placed in games themselves. Game cities are also, up to a point, simulations of real life cities, or at least what we imagine non real life cities to be. They are definitely narrative actors. They are excellent and really pithy showcases of our world building. It is not, an accident that many worlds start off in a city, because in a city we have all the major elements of an imaginary and different world, and it's easier for people to understand them. So if you've played, the classic Planescape Torment, it is not an accident that it actually takes place in Sigil, which is a city that encompasses and expresses the whole setting. And then game cities, just like real cities, are incredibly varied. And they are also the major stages for gameplay or storytelling, or at least they can be. And I'm also always thinking of, Final Fantasy VII and similar games, which are set in cities, and those cities deeply influences their stories. And then game cities are, by definition, very, very complex configurations that need to be abstracted. And much of a designer's work when approaching a game city is actually abstracting it and just keeping the things that can be modeled and can be done and are pithy enough to show to players. So to kick things off, like on a more practical setting, let's see how actual urban planning and design matter. The thing is that good urban planning and real planning logics and solutions and well-known historical patterns, as well as the principles of science and especially city geography, all those can and often should be applied and incorporated into our game cities. They should be incorporated because virtual and game cities are indeed supposed to be cities. So they have to simulate the illusion of being in a city, and they have to feel convincing, and they have to function as we expect cities to do. What's more, planning and design from the real world can offer us solutions and good ideas. For example, we could use traffic heiresses to help people navigate our cities and understand when they're in the center or when they're in the suburbs. We can, design cozy squares by keeping in mind that in real life, cozy squares are no longer no wider than 30 or 35 meters, or that a comfortable sidewalk is always one that allows for two people to walk abreast. Those are rules that we can easily adapt and incorporate into our video game settings. But what we also have to do is keep in mind that when we translate from the reality into the virtual world, that this is a new medium, that the game experience and the level design necessities have to be at the core of our approach, and we should take such things as the point of view into consideration. For example, people see space very differently when it is presented to them in first person, in third person, from above, or from eye level. So we have to keep this in mind and make certain that people can navigate our 3D space, for example, in the first person shooter conveniently, without running into obstacles that makes their lives more difficult. And then we also have to take into consideration the fact that we cannot model everything. The cost of assets would be huge, would be impossible even for a great company to cover. So we have to make certain we choose wisely. And in certain cases, we can also flip the guidelines of real life planning on their heads, especially when we're looking to create something completely different. We can, for example, completely disregard the rules regarding comfortable roads or safe public spaces when we are designing for horror, for dread. We can completely ignore human scale and plan labyrinths and use odd symmetries that may be frowned upon by good design practices, but can help us conjure a sense of atmosphere that we need. Similarly, we can create dreamlike or essentially impossible environments simply by ignoring core urban functions. Aesthetically speaking, though, and this is something to be applied in most game cities, and I would argue in most real cities too, if we were to design them ex novo, a nice balance of order and chaos can work wonderfully. And they can work wonderfully because we as humans tend to enjoy the sense of a planner's intelligence and forethought. We appreciate knowing that this particular space, this plaza, this sidewalk has been designed with us in mind. But we also enjoy the surprises of civic spaces. We love running into the unexpected. And this is why mixing things up often works. I mean, it can often work when you look at it from above, too. Mixing things up makes civic realities more interesting, maybe even fascinating, and definitely more memorable. So, what are the basics of virtual city crafting? First of all, every city has to make sense. That is, every city has to be coherent. It has to feel right in its setting. It has to have rules that constantly apply. So it can make sense. It can feel coherent even in deep space. It can feel right in a high fantasy setting, but it will not feel right in a world where we've accepted that gravity exists and no magic exists, and yet the water flows upwards. This is something that simply feels wrong, not fantasy. And we want things to make sense and create this illusion of realism, because realism is what leads to believability, and believability is what can lead our players or the people experiencing our spaces to a sort of spatial immersion, a feeling that they are actually there inside our world. Another thing that I strongly urge people who design cities to do is try to not only think on the architectural scale, try to think like urban planners and geographers, try to see the bigger picture, try to see the connections of different areas and districts, and not just focus on, architectural details. Absolutely, let your city tell its story. Let it inspire your game design, your narrative, and even your set pieces. Definitely research your urbanism, and by research I mean do try to look into urban history and the history of cities. Look for weird examples from real life. Try to understand how cities in different eras work, and by doing that, not only will you create something better, but you will also find solutions to problems you never realized you had. Things such as lighting a medieval city. When you research that, you will definitely come upon fantastic solutions that might even help guide your art from now on. And keep in mind that every urban center is a historical societal construct, and thus something that is never finished. It is dynamic, and it is a constant and ever evolving, or devolving in certain cases, work in progress. Definitely focus on urban functions. Those are core concepts in in the sciences that have to do with cities, for they are actually the reasons cities exist. Urban functions are what cities do and what they are meant to do. They are cities themselves are built to facilitate and support them, and in turn evolve as those functions evolve. And we will be discussing them a bit more further on. For now, just keep in mind that urban functions are an important thing to keep in your mind when designing. A good way to start designing is actually ask yourself three things. It's like, when is your city, where it is, and how big it is. Those things will define everything from the climate to the actual size to the density to the technology available to you. And keep in mind that all urban space has been planned. Things are not random. Even when we describe the medieval city as an organic creation, in reality it was actually planned by rulers, by kings and dukes and bishops, and even by local people's captains and architects and everything. Everything that has been put into space has been put there for a reason, even if we cannot understand what exactly that reason is. You definitely have to approach the city as a whole and try to see the general picture first, and try to move from the general to the specific, from the broad stroke to the detail, while realizing that cities are internally differentiated. You have districts of poor people, you have districts of rich people, you have districts of Asian people in an American metropolis, or Europeans in an Asian metropolis, and then you have districts that might be colored in a particular way, and industrial districts and areas by the sea, etc., etc. Just keep in mind that this is not an unchanging space. Urban infrastructure in this space is important. It is the skeleton on which the city rests. It's what allows it to live and go on. And remember that all settlements have a form, and this form is greatly defined by the structure, which we will be seeing again in detail later on. And try to consider how players will arrive at your city, what the entrance in this world will be, what the landmarks that will define it will be. And always keep in mind that this is a very level design, if you want, consideration, that your city will have to have boundaries. Even if those are never to be accessed or tested by your players, it will have to have boundaries, at least in your designing mind. So, as promised, urban functions, what they are. And they are, as I said, the things that that cities do. And one reason I like to bring them up is that video games often tend to ignore them. And this is why some of the game cities, especially in older times, were aesthetically disappointing, felt wrong, felt like, a theater's background, something that is paper thin and incomplete. And those games also miss the opportunity to make their settlements even more interesting. For if we admit that, look, we need a city in our geography that is heavily industrialized, or we need a specially constructed transportation hub. All those things can act as core ideas that will guide city creation. Now, to give you an example of what urban functions are. For example, in contemporary times, nowadays, major key urban functions, things that a city has to provide its people with, would have to be residence, commerce, production, consumption, the reproduction of us humans, transportation, culture, ideology, the circulation of capital, access to drinking water and energy. All those things are things that cities absolutely have to do. Then again, if we look back, at the medieval times or ancient times, we would say that, defense would be an everyday function too. That's why during the Middle Ages, a wall was part of a city's definition. Or if we look at, trying to imagine a deep space settlement, its functions would absolutely have to allow for the survival of people, surrounded by the deadly emptiness of space. So keeping in mind what the city has to do, it has to provide, water in a desert, in a fantasy environment. So if you keep that in mind, you create the Gerudo village in the latest Zelda, where you have this wonderful oasis with a magical waterfall in the middle of the desert, which also makes sense in the cities, in the game's setting. Interestingly, urban functions, those things that we generally describe as residence or commerce, have to take space in the actual city. And this is when they get transformed into land uses, as we call them. That is what a specific part of a city is used for. And the distribution and organization of the land uses is what we tend to describe as urban structure. And urban structure is generally speaking, a very, very complex matter. But the easiest way that planners have been taught about structure and they're still being taught about it are the three major and very well known, and also not particularly correct, but still very easy to conceptualize descriptions of the Chicago school from the 1920s and 30s. So the first way to look at city structure, a first option if you want, something that you can play with and modify to your heart's content and to your game city's needs, is this model where you have concentric cycles and rings, one around the other. In the middle, you have the central business district, surrounded by the wider center, which is then surrounded by working class residences, then suburbia, then exurbia. If you add density to that, you get a sketch roughly like this one, but you don't have to keep 1920s Chicago in mind. You could have, in the center, you could have a dark cathedral where the necromancer lives, and around it the sentient vampires, and then you have the graves where the zombies are raised from, whatever, depending on what game you're working on. What matters is that this is a model that puts emphasis in the center. The most important thing is in the center, and the more we go outwards, the less dense and the less important, the less crucial that is. Then we have the sectoral model, which is a bit like the previous one, but it's slightly more adaptable to topographies and actually looks a bit more interesting too, which is also very nice when we're trying to create something memorable and unexpected. When we're trying instead to create, something as complicated as the modern metropolis, for example, for a game set in the 20th or 21st century, or maybe even in the future, or, if we want to come up with the idea for a cyberpunk setting, well, this would be a nice starting point. You have a variety of sub-centers, though you still have a central business center here, which is right next to a wholesale or light manufacturing, but still economically important area. And then you have the poor living in the areas marked as 3, and you have the middle classes living at this area, the 4 area, with the high classes here. And then you have the specified sub-centers and suburbs. You have this secondary business district, and you have a residential suburb, and then you also have an industrial suburb. And this is a structure that should actually feel right to most people living in cities these days. Structure aside, what you have to keep in mind too is that we have densities, and densities define a large part of the image of a city. First of all, we have residential densities, where people live. Again, in most places, people tend to live more in the center, but not with the equal intensity. For example, the center is way stronger in New York and way more prominent than it is in London. And then in Hong Kong, you can see that you have an almost universal type of density. If you move from residential densities, though, to working densities, that is, where people actually go to produce, to work, you can see that this central model actually gets intensified. And the change from this density to this density implies flows, implies traffic. So now you know that people in your city will drive from the suburbs to the center, or will have to be carried via bus, carriage, by walking, by flying carpet, whatever. They have to travel from one place to the other, and this is a flow that will make your city feel right, and also give it a sense of dynamism that will make it be a living place with a proper, even if exotic, economy. Then you have to try and tackle the matter of the street shapes. The grid, and here I have this slide showing you the Great American Grid and its variations. The grid has been around for thousands of centuries. It is a very sensible and very easy way to organize land. You can see it, in the vast majority of Roman cities, with the exception of Rome itself. You can see it in ancient Greek cities. You can see it, even up to a point in ancient Egyptian cities, and it goes on. It has been the defining style of streets throughout the colonization area of the world. It has been a staple of modernist planning and architecture. It's been played with, during the Renaissance, with weird symmetries and rhythms, because exactly the grid can adapt to anything. and it's very easy to angle it, it's very easy to change its proportions, it's very easy to add diagonal streets to it, and it's very easy to use to parcel land and make it either very easy to sell or very fair to everyone. Of course, not all streets have to be, shaped like that. Another example again from the US is, one of the later applications of the Baroque style, where you have, axes and squares, and the three streets living from a square. Here in particular, this was first seen in Rome, actually, but it is a staple of Baroque planning. But anyway, the thing is that after you have, your city structure, after you have your densities, you do have to at some point tackle how the streets of your city will roughly look. And the grid is a very, very good option. Another option would be to combine things, and this is a map of Florence, and you can actually see at the core we have the grid, and then we have some definite axial elements, and the effect of older walls and the effect of newer constructions such as this massive railway. And the same thing goes on in Brussels, where the old city walls actually still shape the core of the city. And if you look, especially in Europe, the vast majority of ring roads around cities, and especially in Central Europe, where are the leftovers of the old walls, the old obsolete walls. So hopefully this will give you inspiration enough to go on and tackle your city streets. And another interesting thing to keep in mind, I do mentioning things that you should keep in mind, for admittedly there are many elements in the construction of cities that simply cannot be missed. Cities are indeed very complex beasts, and even when we strongly abstract them, we do have to make certain they feel right, and it's very easy to get things wrong. And this is why sometimes just stealing straight from reality might be a good idea, because when you want to create a background in a fictional city and you just steal a picture, I don't know, from Paris and put it there and change it a bit, this picture of yours will have the ability to have all the elements of reality in it, because all the things that we have to consider to recreate reality from scratch are simply there, and we can steal them. Anyway, onto planning and the production of space. This is a very small example to show you how planning affects space and produces space, and then how the produced space itself requires even more planning. So let's suppose for a minute this is the city we have, and this is, I don't know, it could be an airport, or it could be important mines, or it could be, I don't know, a very important port. So what planning does is essentially it connects via road, via, I don't know, a train line, whatever. It connects the two important things together, the city with its resource. And by doing that, though, it sort of invites people to come and live here. So if this is Athens and this is its airport, people start living here, and maybe even creating a shop or an outlet or a gas station. And as those things start, becoming richer and more dense and more populous, then planning again has to come back and serve them perhaps with a new road, which in turn will create new needs and new realities. And this is how things work. You have people do stuff, planning tries to regulate that and creates new needs and new configurations. So as a small pause to the theory of things, to have a look at some games it is absolutely worth exploring and enjoying, and of course studying. So first of all, one of my favorite cities and one of the most beautiful ones is definitely Rapture, that has appeared in BioShock 1 and 2. It's a very imaginative, very memorable, and very distinctive place. It has been built underwater, and it is very, very Art Deco in the way we imagine, New York in the early 20th century. It has a very strong physiognomy. It has a character that we can remember, and this character was strongly shaped and organized by two pillars. The one is this objectivist ideology that this dystopia was built around, and the second one was the fact that it was underwater. So you have this very pressing and dangerous environment surrounding it. Combine the two, give us a city that has endured. And then we have Dunwall from Dishonored, which is again not an open world. Bioshock wasn't an open world either. They are both very curated spaces. So in Dunwall, we have a living, breathing space with a very well researched architecture that steals a lot from London, and a place that initially makes sense because it was actually built around a very characterful and very unique economy that is based on whales and whale oils. So this defines, everything from the currency to the things that you collect in game and the power ups and the locations that you get to visit. And what's more, Dishonored sets its battles in logical, sensical places that are mostly populated by guards, and thus um, making certain that your assassinations generally do not upset the public too much, and make certain that things are outside the uncanny valley. It also provides us, with a very differentiated space. You have the stark, spatially organized class division, and which also give rise, to very interesting, though not necessarily progressive, civic politics. And speaking of curated spaces, when playing through Dishonored, you realize that Dunwall is a huge space. You realize that it is a metropolis, even though you are never going to see all of it. And this means that its creators never needed to model everything in detail, or the city in its entirety. Instead, you are provided with very clever views. You travel by boat from the hub, from the place where you get your missions to its mission. So you get to see low poly versions of the city that sort of help you imagine the complete thing. Occasionally you're also shown a map or two just to fill in any blanks. Another city absolutely worth mentioning is the city, not particularly impressively or interestingly named. It's called The City from The Thief, which is a pioneering urban environment. It's one of the first cities in an immersive sim, and one of the first game spaces that actually provided us with a very tangible sense of place. It was wonderfully done because it forced players to really pay attention to the environment due to the game's mechanics. So you had to pay attention to what sound a stone floor makes, and where the shadows are and everything. And this helps you, actually, it puts your imagination into overdrive and helps you fill in all the blanks that the game's aging technology could not ever hope to fill in. We could say that this is a fractured space, the continuity of which is actually offloaded onto you, the player's brains. Another absolutely wonderful example is the New Bordeaux from Mafia 3, which is it comes with a wonderful realistic mix of architectural styles that range from Spanish and French colonial to international style modernism and postmodernism. Here you have parks and open spaces and the surrounding by you that actually bring the natural environment of the city inside the city itself. And this is pretty rare in video games, and something that really helps bring out the space and the locality and the place out. Newport is absolutely worth visiting, not just for the game, because it is a really big, open world, ambitious, believable city that is worth exploring, and that is a fine example of how we can get inspired by a real city, in this particular case, New Orleans, to actually change it into something that fits our game design needs and stories. And then absolutely City 17 by Half-Life 2, one of my favorites, which is now amazingly 16 years old and is still one of the most, convincing and coherent and very economically designed and historical and, gameplay appropriate and memorable urban environments ever created. And also one of the places that really showed how much a major landmark in this particular occasion, the citadel tower in the middle of the city can work into, guiding the players both when it comes to gameplay and when it comes into orientation. Absolutely worth mentioning, Shanghai from Canyon Lakes 2, a city that was very dynamic, and you could feel it changing around you as the old slums and the old alleys are being demolished to be replaced by the skyscrapers in the background. What's absolutely worth noting here is also the fact that this feels very lived in, and it's packed with detail. And sometimes the density of detail can help us recreate the sense of something large. Only something really as large and complex as Shanghai can hope to have all those little things together here. Assassin's Creed Syndicate London, not very fond of the games themselves, but absolutely adore the recreation of a historical city. And this is a Victorian open world city that really manages to include most major landmarks and key infrastructure and the characteristic district types of the London of the area, and cram them all into a relatively small space. And this is, they have done their research and they know that industry and residents were actually next to each other, especially in the poor areas, and that parks and villas went together, and you have all those clever abstractions that somehow managed to cram the first metropolis, the first metropolis of the modern age, the first city that surpassed millions of inhabitants, into a really small area that you can traverse. And this brings me on to the art of abstracting space, whether real or imaginary. You have to abstract space. You cannot hope, as already mentioned, recreate everything in detail. And here, if you compare the map of London as it appears in Assassin's Creed with the real-life map of London from the era, you can see that it has kept the major, most characteristic stuff intact. I mean, it has kept the L bend of the Thames, and it has kept the position of Westminster, and has kept all those things, but it has reduced the detail. You don't have every building, you don't have every building block, you don't have everything, you just have the things that matter. And whenever you focus in a particular in a particularly important thing, such as the Parliament with its Big Ben and everything, you have a detail of almost one-to-one. You recreate almost everything. There's almost no abstraction there. But when you move into the in-between spaces, the less important, the less well-known ones, you just wildly abstract more. And this is how you make compact spaces. You allow modern technology to cope with what you've created, and also keep costs into a logical bracket. Even games like the later Spider-Man for PlayStation 4, which was an impressive recreation of Manhattan, they have taken liberties with New York too. They have vastly reduced the number of buildings shown. They have used many modular elements, and if you take a moment, you will see that, for example, these windows and these windows are exactly the same, and this is a clever thing to do. And what's very interesting is that they've also added things. They've added alleys to New York, and whereas there was an interview, there was a speech actually by one of the designers saying that in real life Manhattan we actually have 6 or 8 alleys, something like that, but we have many more. We have dozens of those in the game because it actually fits it. And this is what I mean by saying that level design should actually help us shape our environments. It should be at the core of our thought. Cities should be there to, first of all, make certain that play happens as we want it to. And here's some examples of abstraction, very, very cartographic ones. So this is, say, the original area of, for example, London, and this is how Assassin's Creed would essentially approach it. You would have you will unify and simplify the form. And similarly with architecture, this is a logical high fidelity abstraction. And if you go way back to the era of Gabriel Knight 3, for example, very maligned game, very excellent game, absolutely suggest you have a look. But you can see that even with much simpler textures and much simpler geometries, you can easily recreate the sense of a city. In cartography, what we do is we tend to refer to crucial points. So and information per level of abstraction. So for a city, when you zoom in, you look at this. Zoom out, you only see the major roads. Zoom out more, you just look at the city shapes, and zoom out on a national scale, and you just see a bullet on the map. And if you go to Google Maps and scroll in and out, you see this abstraction and the abstraction algorithms happening in real time. Now, abstracting is one thing, implying size and scale is another. Good thing is that even though we cannot create everything, we cannot create huge worlds, we can use a variety of tricks to help our players imagine huge worlds. So if the truth is that even a single image, for example, this one, can convey a sense of scale. By looking at this and looking at the density of detail and looking at the density of houses and all the linen hanging from the balconies and the windows, you can understand that this is a packed place. Look at the background and you can see that this is a large place, not just a packed one. You cannot have this scene in a village. It has to be a city. And also we can use, symbols and imply patterns. For example, in Whiterun, in Skyrim, you didn't have the whole rich area modeled, but you just substituted with a major palace, with a major keep. So instead of having 10 buildings, you have one that stands in for a whole type of area. And speaking of patterns, this is a still from a movie called In the Mouth of Madness, and it's supposed to take place mostly in a weird, very Lovecraftian city. And all you're shown of the city is essentially this road, which is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 buildings, and those 7 buildings somehow manage to convey the sense of an actual town. Why? Because they're set up like this. This is how they are organized. They are organized in the typical way an American Main Street is organized. You could have the same 7 buildings reorganized in the ways, for example, I'm showing you here, and imply total different things. From a sparse village to a packed urban block to totally unconnected stuff in a rural area. So the way we place things can actually help players imagine size and conjure scale in their minds. Another thing we can do to imply size and save of assets is like actually block areas, as done here by Grim Fandango, or have actually sounds coming from behind walls. So you're never going to visit that place, but you can hear the salesman shouting about her wares, for example. And another trick, especially in open world or large 3D environments, is instead of having straight roads that tend to show how limited they are, you can just bend them a little, and those are the exact same assets, they're exact same buildings, and just by bending the road a little, you have this sense that this is a denser, larger, more interesting, more mysterious even place, and you save on CPU and GPU power too. And then you can use procedural generation and maybe even tamper with that, especially when it comes to views. It's not always very easy to hold up for a procedural area. It's very difficult for it to hold up when closely inspected, but it can really provide with some excellent views, or it can provide with a very good canvas, which we will later fill with to make perfect. It's always an option. And definitely we can have maps to help players both navigate themselves and also fill in the blanks. In Gabriel Knight, the original Gabriel Knight, you had this whole map of the downtown area. You also had a second map, so it was okay, but you could also visit a few places, like 5 or 6 places. The fact that those 5 or 6 places were placed on a map actually gave them context, actually connected them to each other. And then again, as games like Thief again here or Silent Hill have shown us, maps are excellent for telling stories. They can be diegetic, they can be in-game, they can be collected, we can have characters scribble on them. And in the case of this wonderful, iOS application, the map itself, and this is a map of Unworkable, the map itself can be sort of a game. It can be animated and packed with detail and used to tell stories and let players discover things. So maps are a very, very powerful tool. Now, I am tempted to leave this video on forever, but yeah, the thing is that we have quite a bit to go through, and we're almost already, time is pressuring us. So another thing to keep in mind that this is both a level design sensibility and an urban design sensibility. It's the matter of navigation and legibility. We have to make certain that people can navigate and go from place A to place B with as little hassle as possible and make it feel as natural as possible. Obviously, in games, we can have, big floating arrows showing them around, and we can have in-game GPSs even in ancient games. But sometimes those gameways are a bit too intrusive, and sometimes they don't work as well as the urbanistic and level design solutions. Now, I won't be going into detail, but I will be mentioning the core concepts as codified up to a point by Lynch and others, and talking about the elements that help people create urban mental maps, that help them understand how things are placed next to each other and know how to go from place A to place B. So first of all, we have paths. Those are routes along which people, move. They are roads. They are actual paths. You know that to go from there to there, you have to pass from the tower and then the bridge, and then you'll, end up in the arena. And then we have edges, boundaries, and breaks in continuity. They can be walls, they can be waterfronts, or even, large buildings connected to each other. And they actually can be, the gulf or the forest, and they help, form a boundary across our map. And then we have districts, special areas characterized by common traits, internally coherent areas. You can have, the old town, the commercial town, the industrial place, the red light district, whatever. Districts that are recognizable even by architecture, by function, by anything. Nodes, another crucial part. There are focal points that help orientation. There are strategic points, if you want. They can be squares and major junctions. And sometimes that is where we place landmarks like the Citadel Tower. These can be major or minor. They can be objective or subjective, but they are always there to help guide our players. And then we can, use the scale of buildings, of roads, of public spaces to show off the particular place, or just make certain that its grade and slope are obvious, that topography plays a role, that the important church is placed on top of the hills for everyone to see, for example. And then why not also, take the civic soundscape into consideration and map this? And we know that by the sea we can hear the seagulls, and downtown we can hear the cars. And those are some real life examples. For example, this is the Arc de Triomphe, which is a landmark placed on a node where major paths lead and cross. This is a node. This is a landmark. Those are the paths. And then Boca is a fantastic place of a highly recognizable district due to the way it's colored. This is in Buenos Aires, in Argentina. And then, the boundaries of Carcassonne, the edges are indeed its walls. So, to slowly start summing things up, here are the three ways we can approach city creation in general. First of all, we can choose an existing city, abstract it, generalize it, stylize it, and use it. This is what Assassin's Creed has been doing and what Gabriel Knight has been doing. And when done right, it can be very interesting. And then we can actually take an existing city or several existing cities or parts of existing cities and modify and combine them and mix their elements and come up, with everything from Mafia-free cities to Vice City, from GTA to Terry Pratchett's Ankh-Morpork. And the other option, the more difficult and probably the more interesting one, at least, creatively, it's create a city from scratch. And this we do by first asking where, when, and how big the city is. Then we list its functions, try to realize what it does, what it has to do, and what each function requires. Then we create its history, we imagine it and layer it and craft it and place, circle period on top of a circle period. And then we come with a rough map of the city and its environs and try to work from the general to specific and plan land uses and design streets and waterfronts and imagine structures. And okay, this is not very simple, but once again, we can, steal stuff from reality and fit it in just to make our life a little bit easier. And finally, a brief, very, very brief history of game cities, just to see that it's been going on. I mean, the design of cities has been going on for 4 decades, actually. First of all, I would like to mention, Antatak from 1983, a complete abandoned monumental city, but also one that is very interestingly laid out on the humble ancient 8-bit ZX Spectrum. You can see the edges, you can see the boundaries, you can see the very, very specific landmarks. And the whole game was about mastering the geography of the city. And then we have Infocom's famous Mind Forever Voyaging, a text adventure, essentially a piece of interactive fiction, where we got to explore the constantly changing and evolving city of Rockwell, which was actually based on very, very archetypical US Midwestern city plans. It is a very realistic, very sensible city, and thus a city that actually helps us empathize with it. We feel that it's familiar, and we realize that all those changes as it descends into dystopia and hellish gangs burning everything and cults killing people, we can imagine how that would impact us. And then we also have a groundbreaking Dandarach from again from the 8-bits, which this is it's a wonderful map as imagined by Oliver Frey, and this is essentially a completely open world 3D city, only done in rotatable 2D and using very cleverly using sprites and you know just modular elements to create this whole thing. Another early 3D city, again open world. Again, some would say the precursor to GTA would have to be 1986's Turbo S-Rig, just to show you a bit how it looks. Oh, sorry. And this was achieved in in the 8-bits, and you had working traffic lights and pedestrians and pedestrian crossings and everything. It was jaw-dropping back in the era. And then you have the traditional fantasy setting, fantasy city, as exemplified in the Bard's Tale. In the first Bard's Tale, you have Skara, which was the whole game essentially took place in a city, and it was a rather lively, rather sensible place for its era. Then you have a totally different take on game cities and urbanism. From the blighted downtown fiction of the 80s, you have Double Dragon and a variety of side-scrolling beat 'em ups where the city acts as the appropriate background again. And then you have SimCity, which actually places urban functions at the core of the gameplay, and you get to decide where things are placed. And despite its ancient and wrong models and all its preconceptions, it's a fantastically revolutionary game. Then we move on to 1993 and Gabriel Knight, Sins of the Father, which I keep referring to because I apparently deeply love. And then we have Grand Theft Auto 1997. It was the first Grand Theft Auto. It was top down, but it pioneered the tongue-in-cheek, slightly cynical open world. Just a year later, we have Baldur's Gate, the isometric, if you want, fantasy city. Partly starring in a huge computer role-playing game that actually revitalized this whole genre for almost a decade. Driver, which is, I would say, the first of the modern open-world urban games where driving is at the core, followed swiftly by Grand Theft Auto 3rd, the first of the 3 Grand Theft Autos, which actually cemented the formula and started going a bit over the top with the violence, followed by its pretty impressive sequel, which was Grand Theft Auto Vice City, which managed to abstract, the physiognomy of Miami and cartoonize it and make it actually fun to play with, before the whole GTA series descended into mindless cynicism and, misanthropy or something. And then we have the seminal Assassin's Creed, the first Assassin's Creed, that showed us that actually revisiting, the cities of antiquity in impressive and cohesive 3D is doable, and that it's actually incredibly fun to do, even if all we got to do was murder people. But in the first games, it was more involved than in the sequels. Dark Souls is also worth noting because the city of Anor Londo is one of my favorite ones, and it's a fine example of how using familiar elements, in this case, being inspired by the Cathedral of Milan and Gothic architecture, and combining those very familiar things into something incredibly otherworldly, makes the otherworldly believable and more relatable, and I would say more interesting and beautiful too. And then we have, Novigrad from the third Witcher, which is an absolutely stunningly recreated medieval early Renaissance city that, it almost has enough houses to fit in the population that it claims to have. It is something that is big and detailed enough to probably be one of the most successful, if you want, open world fantasy cities ever. And to imagine that it's just part of a wider world that makes it even more of a Herculean task to create that. Absolutely worth visiting and absolutely a staple in the development of the medium. Then we have 2017 Super Mario Odyssey, which has, the Metropolis levels, which is a wonderful abstraction of urbanism itself. You have, just the elements, the symbolic elements of the modern city, and you play with them as much as possible, and you play with their verticality, and it goes to show that, cities as inspiration can actually function in completely unexpected ways. Marvel Spider-Man, once again, a very, very impressive game to look at, exactly due to the size of it. And just to top things off, and I do believe that we will be sharing the slides, a few reading suggestions, some of the urbanism classics, such as Kevin Lynch's Good City Form and Alexander Silverstein's and Ishikawa's A Pattern Language. I cannot stress enough how brilliant Kostov's The City Shaped is. It is, I would say, it's the absolute authority in creating, road shapes and organizing cities, and something most game designers or level designers should have in their library. The City History by Lewis Mumford is a wonderful read, despite its, certain very, very idealistic preconceptions. It's still a wonderful and very learned read. And then in the more gamey side of things, we have the Cobalt Guide to World Building that has been edited by Jana Silverstein, and it's pithy and compact and pretty amazing. The collection called Architectonics of Game Spaces, edited by Gerber and Getz. And then Totten's wonderful architectural approach to level design, which is a wonderful bridge between, the spatial sciences and arts and, level and game design. And in case you want to read a bit more level design and how to approach it, definitely Kremer's level design book is something I wholeheartedly suggest. Finally, if you want to get in touch, ask anything, suggest, point to something, you can find me in a variety of places, including Twitter and email and my site. And with that, I want to thank you and hope it wasn't far too long. So thanks so much.
Thank you, Konstantinos. Here I am again, and I think it was a very, very nice and interesting presentation, and it will be available on the Editro website. The full video will be available. Now we have 5 minutes for the question, but as I told you before, we can meet after the lecture here. This is the link on screen, but you can find the link on our Facebook page or in the comments of the Facebook Live. But I have two questions. I'm going to put them on the screen so you can read them. The first one, sorry. Okay, the first one is this from Matteo. Sorry, I'm going to remove your presentation so you are not so you can see your face. Remove. Okay, even if we have to, just like yesterday, we had to stand up to How much are game cities a representation of real cities and real urban function, and how much are they reproduction of game cities? I mean, how much are they influenced by their own video game representation, for example, by titles like GTA 3 that inspired the world 3D open world urban space of current video games?
Yes, this is a very, very fair question by Matteo, and I would say that the better ones are closer to reality, and the less thought out ones are closer to gaming's archetypes. And for example, I mean, I wouldn't use GTA as much as an example, but especially in in RPGs, you can see that we know that a settlement has to have a tavern, a fantasy settlement has to have a tavern, a couple of blacksmiths, a shop, a church, whatever, and you have like all those gameplay things and things that we've been accustomed to, and they are just supported by 4 or 5 houses, and this creates something that's simply there for gameplay purposes and usually feels wrong because you have like this tiny settlement that in the medieval era would have nothing. They would have probably a few pigs and the priest, and that's it. And you have all the stuff that you would find in a town. And this is partly due to what Matteo says, that sometimes the medium itself inspires and guides more than reality and science and art, perhaps. This is not always bad, though. I mean, in some cases, we have certain things that are medium only, but are there because they work. For example, I mean, the GTA's ideas of, car painting stuff. This is something that works mechanically. It's okay. It fits in. So,
there's another question. I'm going to put it on screen right now. From my colleague Stefano, who is watching the live from Facebook and YouTube. Thank you for your interesting presentation. In digital cities, usually players have affordances that differ from those in real-life cities. How does this affect the very idea of virtual urban space? Real-life urban space are something upon which we, as individuals, have less control or power over.
Well, first of all, I would say that the amount of control or power we have is always, defined and provided by the designers. So, for example, in an open world, in a sandbox game, you have quite a bit of control and power over what you can do. But for example, in an RPG, you do not have as much. You might have, people that kill you when you try to do something illegal, or people that attack you when you try to visit a particular place, or playing the Hitman games, you have very specific allowances. You have public places where you can stroll through easily. You can have semi-public spaces like a cafe where you can stroll through and sit in, provided you're a customer, and then you have actual private spaces where if you are spotted, you're getting shot. So the amount of freedom over the space we have it always depends. But sir, this is the second part of the question. Could you first please repeat?
Yeah, I can show you again. Okay.
Okay, so what I wanted to say about that is that one of the ways that people use actual space in reality is that they're guided by their needs and they're guided by the functions that will cover these needs. So when, for example, we are designing for an MMO, we are designing the cities of World of Warcraft, and we want to have a vibrant center. What we have to do is sort of copy reality, but in a very different way. We will not copy the functions of reality. I mean, residence in a game usually doesn't matter. But what matters, for example, is quest givers and shops. So in downtown, in downtown MMO city, I will put a couple quest givers, a bank, a forger, and a seller, and this will create a traffic towards this place. I will put the functions of the game that will be of interest to the player next to the aesthetic, let's say, background functions of the actual city, and sort of combine them in something that works and feels right and is interesting gameplay wise. I hope that's sort of an answer.
Yeah, I think so. Like, maybe Stefano is going to be with us in the virtual room, so maybe continue our chat in the virtual room. So I think that for the lecture, we are okay today for this lecture. So let's meet in the afternoon with the interview with Valentina Paggiarin and Giacomo Talamini from my division, and tonight at 6:30 with the Centre Pompidou from Paris. So thank you, Konstantinos. Let's meet.
Thank you very much.
Let's meet there on the virtual room, and
yes,
thank you again. See you soon. Maybe in Italy in the future.
Yes, that would be wonderful.
Bye bye. See you.
Bye bye. See you all in the virtual.
Bye bye.